In this video, we're going to look at basic lighting, recording, editing, and deployment for DMX, ArtNet, and streaming ACN channels within Showforge. Let's get started. The first thing we want to do is go under the Setup and Input tabs to make sure that we have a digital and analog input associated with our project that we can use to record DMX, ArtNet, or streaming ACN output. Once we have these inputs set up, let's click over to the Output tab. We have some digital outputs. We've also got an older lighting recording here, but I want to add a single output that I can deal with one or multiple DMX output channels. If I select this output here, I can pick my output just like I would in analog or digital and select the number of channels that I want to control. Let's say we had a 3-channel dimmer that we wanted to control all at once. I could do 1 through 3, and those would all be handled as one single output, very similar to our recording. However, if I wanted to do a 1-to-1 ratio, let's set up actually 3 different channels. So I'll call this one red. And just so I don't forget, blue. And single output of green. And this one is going to be set to 1. This one I'll change to 2. And the last one I'll set to 3. So each of these is set to the range, and I messed that one up there, of 1, 2, and 3. Now, if I were to add an individual track, so I'm going to add a new group and 3 new tracks, and I'm going to fold up my lighting recordings, and here I'm going to set this to red, this to green, and this to blue. And for my inputs, I'll go ahead and just assign a keyboard key to each of these. We'll do keyboard key Z. And I'm going to select record, roll my timeline, and as you'll notice here, I've created some data just using the standard recording, either from a joystick like I mentioned, or in my case a keyboard. And as I zoom in here, you can see that I've got traditional editing that I can point edit. I can draw within the envelopes, so if I want a little bit of analog data, I can draw a line or a curve, and then of course I can point edit that data as required, and that's actually my RGB value. I've gone back to my save project here because I want to look at 2 additional things. First, let's have a look at setting up a group of fixtures in a little bit more efficient of a manner. Using the project devices capable of exporting DMX, ArtNet, ACN, I'm going to go under the plus symbol here, and rather than adding a single output for R, G, and B, I'm going to add multiple outputs. I'm going to do this using both dashes and commas, so I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3, and then I'm going to do 4 through 20. Under this, I'm going to say RGB fixture channel. And what I'm going to do is create sort of a parent channel here that we can set as our red, green, and blue parent outputs. This will allow us to just have 3 tracks for red, green, and blue, even though we may have 5, 6, 7, 8 fixtures. It makes programming much more efficient and doesn't require you setting up the same tracks and having all that data to deal with, particularly when it comes down to editing. So now that I've got those set up, I'm going to go back to my track mode, and I'm going to fold all these up, and I'm going to add a new group. And in this group, I'm going to call this RGB fixtures, and I'm going to set up 3 tracks. With these 3 tracks, I'm going to set an output for red, green, and blue respectively. However, now under here, I can set up as many outputs as I want as mirrored relationships to give this that parent-child relationship. So if I set this to 4, and then of course to 7, and 10, and so forth down the line, I've got these outputs that are all going to follow or mirror that primary red output. This means I don't have to keep programming the same channels over and over again. Under this track now, I have the ability to create this data, so I can use a line to create a sine wave or square wave. I can do point editing, or I can do this straight line tool if I want something that's a little bit more linear. Of course, the track is currently set to off, but we can set this to play, live, latch, or whatever. With this, though, you'll see there's a couple things that are happening. Number one, as I play the track, this data is going to output to the tracks that were all listed in this track heading. So as this is at 60%, these red fixtures are all following that output. The other thing I want to look at here in terms of how lighting is going to respond is that, remember, this is not like a light board. You are actually dealing with live data. You're not dealing with a Q-to-Q scenario. So every frame of data in Showforge is going to have an output relationship to it. Under here, if I create similar data to show me the synchronization between R, G, and B, notice I've got these different levels here, and I'm going to go and I'm going to change that whole group into play. This curve here, where there actually is no data, represents almost like a ramp or a fade time between one cue and another. However, note that everything in Showforge is based off linear interpolation, and it is not going to actually crossfade like you'd have a lightboard output playback setup. This is actually better for motion control and can give you more of a smooth or linear ramp. So if I were to pick the slide tool, group slide tool, and select all three of these, as I move these back and forth, you'll notice here, oops, and I split that envelope quickly there. You'll notice that this ramp between these two envelopes is very similar to your fade time on a light board. Okay, I've gone back again to my saved project so we can take a look at one last thing. And that's the relationship of analog and digital inputs as they go to outputs either on a Weigl device, that is a contact closure, or on a non-dim or dimmer circuit in the lighting world. So I'm going to use these button lights as examples. These are linked to a digital output on the ProCommander. So inherently, they are a digital type output. Now, if I turn on my point editing mode or my drawing mode, you're going to see this dashed line that goes right in the middle of the screen. So if I have a line here, notice that if I were to create my tool for the line draw, that I have off and on basically above or below those lines. So if I go up, great, that's an on. If I go down, that's an off, an on, and off, and on, and off, and on, and you'll see that those data points are represented as such. The same thing would happen if I did a curve here and did like a sine wave. It's going to translate that into an on and off status. Well, what happens if I go back and I have a non-dim circuit that I now want to make a dimmer circuit? Does that data get lost? Does it get changed? The short answer is, if I change this even to one of my batch outputs that is analog, this entire universe, universe 1, is going to be responding to that data now in an analog fashion. In Showforge, our data is inherently stored at a 16-bit output level as an analog track. The data interpretation of above 50% or below 50% is done based on the output only. You'll also notice this in the console mode here, that any of the digital outputs are represented as an on-off state with a red or green light, and the analog outputs are the range there, which is the VU style meter. This is tied to the output side of things, not the input side. So your input is always stored as analog, even if we are processing it as digital. Similarly, if I were to go under inputs and I have an analog input, I'm going to go ahead and capture now a MIDI console button here that's going up and down, and I'm going to hit save and close. Of course, I could scale that. I could do all of my other relationship type inputs and outputs for settings there in Showforge, but I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to go and actually delete a few of these envelopes here, and you'll notice how things are adjusting. And I'm going to do a short recording on this track. So I'm going to set this to record, and I'm going to double check that I have MIDI and I have universe 1. So here, theoretically, I'm going to be recording the entire universe of DMX at this punch-in point, and this should respond to the MIDI slider. And you'll see here that this data is going up and down as I move my slider. Now, if I stop here, it's going to create that ramp like we talked about from the previous envelope to the next envelope. I'll go ahead and move this group back to play. And as I drag this, you'll notice that my visual fade time from the previous envelope to the next envelope is represented here by this line. Inside of the envelope, unless I actually went in and modified some of these points, that data is real time. It's going to be going from one point to another with a smooth linear interpolation. So just for the sake of example, I'm just going to move some of these data points down. kind of do like a fade here to get some of them below 50%. And then, of course, I want to get some of them above 50%. Now, I'm going to change that universe 0 back to a digital output, and let's see what happens here. So those data points still exist. They don't go away. Now, I'm in point editing mode, so I'm going to turn that off because that's a little bit confusing. But if I turn that off, notice that the only points that I had that were above 50% were represented by this block. The remainder of those points do not go away. They're still there in the track edit. In fact, I can even turn on point editing to say, okay, where are those points below 50%? Where are those points above 50%? And as I drag some of those points above 50%, it's going to work like a relay or a non-dim circuit in the lighting world. So again, we are always storing that data as 50% is on, lower than 50% is off. So hopefully that and some of this track manipulation can help you create a show if you need to with the animation style tools that we have in Showforge. At a certain point, you're always going to go to external software for pixel mapping or full lightboard creation, but certainly for some basic RGB fixtures, you're going to have a lot of options here in Showforge directly. Note that there are a lot of other predefined lighting effects that are coming in to our library so that you would be able to do some more basic things without actually having to use a physical input device, but you do have plenty of tools here at the moment for either creating data from tools on your machine or an external lighting board or software. Once the creative part of your project is done and you're happy with the results as they look in the field, you're ready to export to the microSD card. There's a lot of values that can also be applied in the control.ini, which can either be done externally in things like VS Code, Notepad, etc., or within the Showforge project itself. These things can help limit values, map to ArtNet or streaming ACN network outputs, or define startup positions and values outside of a running timeline. For more information on these, please see additional training videos and documentation on the control.ini and the Weigl WEM script language. Again, here you'll see some things that set the max value. So this is limiting the overall scale. It's kind of like a clamp or parking a dimmer channel or things like that within the lighting world. And again, mapping a ArtNet universe or virtualizing that physical output on the ProIO or ProCommander to a DMX universe elsewhere. So all these things are defined once in the control.ini. They're exported with your show and would apply globally to each individual show. If you are doing an ArtNet or streaming ACN show, you can do this in Configurator. You could also do it in the control.ini, but we do recommend hard coding it into your show as we're showing here, so that when you update the creative portions of things, ArtNet and streaming ACN are reflected accordingly in this INI. These aren't also one-to-one. They can be soft patched, so Weigl Universe 1 or ProIO 1 can be mapped to the related ArtNet Universe 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. It's a virtual soft patch for what DMX Universe would go to what ArtNet or streaming ACN output. And if you have any additional questions, please contact us at support@weiglcontrols.com.